As you know, Francisco is a PhD student in the Department of Geography, is Ecuadorian, and has worked in the Galapagos several years, even before coming to UNC Chapel Hill. So we're very pleased that he's been able to move the needle quite a bit on learning about people and environment in the Galapagos Islands. And as long as it is being recorded, yes. Okay, thank you, Francisco, for doing that. And I'll turn the floor over to you for the presentation. Thank you.
Well, hello, everyone. It is so exciting to see everyone here. I wish I could do this in person, in a room, but I guess one of the advantages of today is that we can extend this to a much wider audience. So here we go. So the title of my dissertation is Agriculture, Wildlife, and Conservation in the Galapagos Islands. So when most people think about the Galapagos, they have these images of the beaches with like the iguanas or the blue-footed boobies. But most people are not aware that the Galapagos can also look more like this. This is in San Cristobal Island, and it is located in the humid highlands of the Galapagos. This looks more like a jungle because this is where water is found. Water transforms these environments into lush environments that make these actually the most productive and diverse regions of the Galapagos. So believe it or not, this is also the Galapagos. These areas are valuable habitat for endemic fauna and flora, such as endemic bird species, the lovable Galapagos tortoises, and endemic flora like Bichonia bushes, the Scalesia trees, etc. The humid highlands are also where 100% of the food that is grown in the Galapagos occurs. This is, believe it or not, also found in the Galapagos, and this is in Isabela Island. The Galapagos has been inhabited since the 1800s when people established agricultural colonies, and agriculture used to be the main economic engine for the region. Since then until the 1970s when tourism took over. And because people have been there for so long, some plants have escaped cultivation and become what is known as invasive. Now, invasive plants are those that were brought into the Galapagos by humans and have proliferated and spread so aggressively that they displace other species. And so here are two examples. On the left is a guava fruit, and you can see just how many seedlings are found in a single fruit. And on the right side, you see the blackberry bushes that have completely overrun an abandoned lot. Invasive species become more of an issue when you're talking about abandoned lots, abandoned agricultural lots, because they thrive in disturbed environments. And so once a farmer stops working their land, then this becomes a threat not only to the adjacent farms, but also to the Galapagos National Park. But most food that is consumed in the Galapagos is imported. This is a photo of Santa Cruz Island. And the vast majority of the food that here was produced by industrial methods and then shipped from the mainland. Only a small percentage of the food that is consumed by the 35,000 permanent residents and 250,000 annual visitors, or at least pre-pandemic times, is grown in the Galapagos. In this picture, the only food that was grown in the Galapagos is the one that is in this corner that is closest to the viewer. Everything else was brought from the mainland. And this creates for a rather unsustainable and vulnerable food system. Unsustainable and vulnerable because, well, sometimes ships crash and then the entire island go into crisis because they're not getting food shipments, but also unsustainable because with each shipment of food increases the likelihood that new invasive species might be introduced. So as you can see, the food system is directly related also to conservation. And precisely, like I said, as it turns out, the highlands are central to both food security and conservation because this is where protected species, invasive species, and food security all meet. However, the humid highlands, I mean, however, there's also a power struggle between who gets to say who and what belongs in the highlands, where a farmer might see a crop, a conservation scientist might see an invasive species, and where a conservation scientist might see an endemic species that is worth protecting, a farmer might see an agricultural pest that is threatening their crops. And unfortunately, this power struggle, it is not a level playing field because farmers have historically lacked representation when at the negotiation table, whenever there are laws being drafted for the entire region. And just to give you an idea of just how much of a blind spot this is, these were maps that were published in 2018, and they represent the most detailed maps of the ecosystems of all islands in the Galapagos. But notice that these maps have a blank spot in the center. That is where the agricultural areas are located. And until 2018 at least, this was a literal blank spot in the map. And farmers don't have a PR problem only within the conservation community, but also with consumers in general. People have no idea everything that farmers have to go through to be able to keep their activity going and to bring products to the market. Farmers are threatened by social, environmental, and economic pressures that are causing them to go out of business and to abandon their lands. Just to name a few things, farmers, especially in the Galapagos, this is really hard to grow food. They are plagued by chronic water shortages and extreme weather events. In 2016, there was like the worst drought in recorded history. They also have to deal with a shortage of labor because newer generations have been drawn away from the fields and into the urban centers to tend to the tourism industry. They also have to deal with an increasing amount of agricultural pests and the laws prevent them from using strong chemicals to deal with these pests. They also have to deal with proliferating invasive plants, and also the laws prohibit the use of industrial machinery to remove them, etc., etc., etc. So the farmers have many pressures from many different sides, and yet somehow farmers are still here. I should have also mentioned that this is an aging population that we are talking about. The average age of farmers in the Galapagos is over 65 years old at this point. So the farmers are stretched thin. They are doing a lot to be able to remain in their land. And so it is urgent that we visibilize everything that farmers are doing as part of the community of the Galapagos. And so all the functions that they serve and also to contribute to agriculture. So the question that I wanted to pose had to have a broader appeal, but beyond just the agricultural community. I asked, how can both conservation and agriculture be sustained in a way that farmers' livelihoods, the control of invasive species, and the protection of endemic species can complement each other? So in order to answer this question, I thought, well, we must look at the interactions precisely between plants, people, and wildlife. But the proximity principle states that things that are closer to each other tend to interact with each other more. So the first step is we need to know where these elements are located. So to find out where land cover maps, to figure out where plants are located, I made land cover maps. To figure out where people are located and what they are doing in their land, I made land use maps. And in order to figure out where endemic wildlife is found, in this case, the giant tortoises are found, I made species distribution models. And to learn how all these things are interacting with each other, I talked to people. So first I'm going to describe each one of these in just broadly. So first, the land cover maps. My objective was to map the agroecosystems of the Galapagos. As you may know, the Galapagos are located 1,000 kilometers off the coast of Ecuador, and 4 of the islands are inhabited by humans. They are pictured here: Isabela, Santa Cruz, San Cristobal, and Floriana. Each one has an agricultural zone, marked here in blue. However, most people live closer to the coast in the urban areas. In this map, it is marked in red. And everything else surrounding the agricultural areas and the urban areas is Galapagos National Park. So it's protected areas, and it is marked here in green. Now, here is a more detailed view of the agricultural areas that's found within the blue. Part of the reason why these areas had not been mapped until recently is because they are in the highlands, they're usually shrouded by clouds. So it's really hard to use satellite images to map them. So what I did is I combed through satellite image collections, and I found different images that had sections with no clouds, and I stitched them together to create this cloudless mosaic of the agricultural areas. Another reason why these areas had not been mapped is because they are very complex and diverse and dynamic. They change rapidly, and there's simply a lot of things that are mixed together very close to each other. So it is very hard to map things that are not neatly laid out. And in order to overcome this problem, I decided to combine 2 different image collections that had different types of high resolution. I mixed the Sentinel-2 collection, which has high spectral resolution, with PlanetScope collection, which has high spatial resolution. And now I will describe what this means. High spatial resolution refers to the amount of detail that an image has. So just to give you a visual, this is a section of Floriana that is viewed with one of the most commonly used image collections, Landsat 8, where each pixel is a 30 by 30 meter section. The Sentinel-2 images have a 10 meter by 10 meter pixel, and as you can see, individual roads are starting to become visible. And the PlanetScope images have a 3 meter by 3 meter size pixel, which allows us to make out individual trees. So this is rather high resolution. High spectral resolution, on the other hand, refers to the segments of the electromagnetic spectrum that a sensor is sensitive to. And you can simply think of it as a sensor's ability to make out different colors in an image. So, for example, here is an image of San Cristobal Island, of the agricultural zone of San Cristobal Island, using only the wavelengths that are visible to the human eye. And as you can see, it mostly looks different shades of green. But if you include a section of the spectrum from the infrared side, suddenly you can begin to differentiate land covers much better. In this image, the bright red corresponds to cedrela trees, the gray corresponds to the rose apple trees, the turquoise corresponds to grass, water is represented as deep blue, etc. So now, armed with these high resolution images, the next step was to decide what are we going to categorize them as. And I thought it was important to use categories that were relevant to both agriculture and conservation practitioners. So conservation practitioners tend to care about where are native ecosystems located. And so they look at where are the Scalencia trees located, where are the Miconia bushes, where are the Patasarno in the deciduous forest. So look at all these different habitats. And they also care about where are the invasive species. Now for this, I was able to identify to the species level, and I was able to find where is quinine tree located, where is the cedar located, the guava, the blackberry, and the rose apple tree. Farmers, on the other hand, might care more about where are their crops located. They are looking for where are the perennial crops located, the annual crops, and especially important cash crops like coffee. So I made sure to identify those. And also, there's a lot of livestock that is being produced in the Galapagos, so pastures are important. So I looked also for what is the extent of cultivated grass, of elephant grass, and of silvopastures. But in order to make sure that what we think is there is actually there, I had to go out into the field and collect GPS points of the different plants and land covers. And I also used a drone to collect very high resolution images of the farms, because these images are so detailed that it allows us to identify individual tree species from an image, from only an image. These images were also used to help us understand space from a farmer's perspective. We would bring these images to farmers and ask them to tell us about what they saw in the image, and from their perspective, the important elements that they saw. And this was very useful for us to not only verify the land cover, but also to help us understand what are important land covers for them. So now, with all this data, I then took to the computer and I trained an algorithm to help me categorize the entire land area. It would have been impossible to do it manually. So I told the computer, this is coffee, this is banana, this is guava. And the result is quite astounding. So once again, this is the agricultural areas, and this is what they look like once they've been categorized. Indeed, we see that these areas are very diverse, very heterogeneous, and this is only considering 20 classifications. We could have categorized it into many, many more. It's very diverse. But now with this, we can begin asking questions. Where are the native ecosystems? And we can see that within the agricultural area, about 19% of the surface area still contains native ecosystems. Unfortunately, over 28% of the agricultural land is covered by invasive species, the vast majority of it, which is guava, represented here in pink. And this represents over 20% of the agricultural land already. And even this is a very conservative estimate because it excludes the guava that may be contained in pastures as part of silvopastoral design. I'll talk more about that later. And pastures are just the most common land cover in Santa Cruz. And in around Galapagos, it represents 22% of the land cover. Crops, on the other hand, cover about 18% of the agricultural land. And as you can tell, they are mostly found along the edges, say in San Cristobal Island, probably because it is warmer in these regions. It is important to note that the categories that were used are compatible with previously published maps. So now, for the first time, we have a complete view of the inhabited islands of the Galapagos. So that was land cover. On to land use maps. For land use, I used census data from an agricultural census that was collected in 2014, and it is extremely detailed. It has 734 variables that correspond to the economic activities of the farmers, the crops that they choose to grow, what do they do with their products, what things do they bring into the farm. And this was done for all active farms in the Galapagos in 2014, which is 755 units of agricultural production. So then I took all this data and I tried to find variables that could tell me something about how environmentally friendly these farms are. So I searched for proxies that would tell me about the farm's agrobiodiversity, such as what land covers farmers report that they have, what crop varieties they say they have, where are they sourcing their seeds from. I also looked at what inputs farmers had for their farm. So do they use herbicides? Do they use pesticides? Do they use fertilizer, organic or synthetic? I also looked at what do they do with their outputs, with their crops. Do they even harvest them? Do they bring them to the market? Do they exchange them? Do they consume it themselves? What do they produce, etc.? And also an element of social organization, which was, do farmers have access to local knowledge? Are they part of a farmers co-op? Do they get advice from the Ministry of Agriculture, etc.? So with all this, I then created a rating system to rate farms from conventional farms with having conventional farming practices to farms that had agroecological farming practices. And I also joined this with the land use that is for the rest of the territory, which is just conservation, because this is the extent of the Galapagos National Park. And now we have a full cover of the land use for the inhabited islands as well. And I'll summarize some of the results. As it turns out, conventional farming practices dominate the Galapagos. There are very few farms that were rated to have agroecological practices. And so here's also their distribution, their geographical distribution. One thing that I noticed is that agroecological farms tend to be larger than conventional farms. And this was also statistically significant when so here's in this graph, you see in the y-axis, you see the size of the farm in hectares and a comparison of the three types of farms. The line in the center of the box plot represents the median value. The lower edge of the box plot is the 25th percentile. The top is the 75th percentile. So within the box plot is the vast majority of the data points. And as you can tell, the difference is quite significant. At first, I was very surprised by these results because I tend to relate conventional or more industrial farming practices with large extents of land and monocrops. But this was probably better explained by a farmer who, I was discussing this with a farmer, and they commented, well, of course that they have a larger farm. Of course they have agricultural practices. They have so much land that they can afford to have environmentally friendly practices. And so I think that this is probably more related to that. The farmers that have larger lands tend to have more resources. They usually have additional sources of income, and many times ties to the tourism industry. So it's likely that, as the farmer put it, they can afford to have agroecological practices. Whereas farmers that only have a little bit of land and depend on only that land and their crops for their livelihoods are more likely to use chemicals. That's my interpretation. But another really interesting result was that, as it turns out, agroecological farms tend to have more invasive species than the other types of farms. Once again, here on the y-axis, you have the percent of the farm that is covered by invasive plants. And as you can tell, agroecological farms seem to have more invasive plants. It is, at first sight, this would seem to support the narrative that chemicals are needed to control invasive plants because conventional farms tend to use more herbicides. However, I think that this is more related to the size of the farm, precisely because when most farmers do not have enough labor to actively manage the entire farm. And so once a farm exceeds a particular size, a large part of it sits without active management. So I think it's related to that. Now moving on to the species distribution models. So I made species distribution models for two islands, Santa Cruz and San Cristobal, and I made two types of models for each. I made knowledge-based models, and I made presence-based models. I will start with the knowledge-based models. For building a model, first I need to start with environmental variables. So I started with elevation data, and here's a depiction of the data for each one of the islands. As you can tell, in the center of the island, where the agricultural region is found, there are mountains. From this data, I derived slope data. And so this shows that perhaps places that have cliffs, and this is important to understand where tortoises may be found because even though they cross a lot of land, they may not be able to climb a cliff. I also use temperature data, and as you can see, once you go up the elevation gradient, it becomes cooler. I use precipitation data, and as you can see, parts of the island tends to be more moist because there is a rain shadow effect due to air currents that come from the south. So the southern regions tend to be more wet. There's the land cover data that I just generated, the land use data that I just generated, and built environment, a representation of the built environment, which includes where buildings are located and the road networks that each island has. And so what I did is I calculated the distance from these places to the rest of the island. So now with that, what is left now is to understand the species that we are interested in. And in this case, we are interested in tortoises. But different tortoises have different habitat preferences. Saddleback tortoises, for example, prefer to live at lower elevations because this is where their main food source, the Opuntia cactus, is located. As you can see, the adaptation that gives the species its name, its frilled neck, allows this tortoise to reach up higher and eat things that are located at above them. On the other hand, dome-shaped tortoises do not have this adaptation. They do not have the saddleback shaped, and so they tend to live at a higher elevation where there is more moisture and therefore more food available closer to the ground. And so I input the different habitat preferences and made a binary layer for each one of these environmental variables. I put 1 if it met the known preferences for that species, and a 0 if it didn't meet those conditions. I then added up all these layers and created this very crude representation of a predicted tortoise habitat. The green tones represent more suitable tortoise habitat. The red tones represent not so good tortoise habitat. And even though this is a very crude model, we can still see some interesting patterns, namely that the agricultural area, which I marked here in red, tends to have a lot of favorable conditions for tortoises. And notice also that in San Cristobal, the favorable habitat extends all the way to the north as well. Now, this was a very sensitive model, but not a very specific, because if you say that the entire island is suitable tortoise habitat, then the model is not very good at distinguishing between habitat and non-habitat. But one thing that should be mentioned is that the most restrictive element from the variables that I used were the road networks. Tortoises have a complex relationship with roads in that they are migratory creatures, and so they may choose to use roads to move up and along the elevation gradient. But if there are too many cars, they may get killed by them. So there's that. Now for the presence-based model, I use the exact same environmental variables, but unlike the previous model where I told the model where we thought was suitable habitat for tortoises, in this model I link the environmental variables with recorded presence data to train a model that would predict where tortoises would be found, given the variation of each data set. And I use this using a program called Maxent, which is one of the most popular and consistently robust methods for generating species distribution models. Maxent uses a machine learning algorithm that follows a maximum entropy principle to generate a prediction of an organism's potential distribution. And a program needs as an input the species presence, which is here marked in blue and red, and the environmental variables. So again, these locations were collected by the Galapagos National Park. The oldest data points were collected in 1999. The most recent ones were collected in 2016. And because these are migratory creatures, I originally wanted to make a distinction between the different locations in different seasons, but because these data points were collected haphazardly, I didn't have a very even distribution of these, so I just lumped everything together to represent a habitat for them during the entire year. And so this was the result, which was way more specific than the other models. And we can see some interesting results from this. You can see that once again, I'm marking where the agricultural area is roughly found. Especially in Santa Cruz, tortoises are very likely to be found inside the agricultural area. And if you see in San Cristobal, most of them are likely to be found up in the northern regions, but you can see a trail that goes down towards the agricultural area. To assess these models, I used an ROC area under the curve test. And just as a quick thing, an AUC value of 0.5 would mean that the model is not able to distinguish between habitat and non-habitat, but all our training and test AUC values were above 0.9. Now, moving on to the interviews. The interviews are qualitative methods I found are extremely powerful because, as they say, not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts. I made a total of, for this study, I made a total of 84 semi-structured interviews with key stakeholders of the food system on all 4 islands, including producers, restaurant owners, authorities, scientific experts, and the interviews took place from 2016 to 2018. The way this worked is I would approach these people and I would ask them open-ended, broad questions such as, what are the greatest challenges to agriculture in the Galapagos? I would then transcribe the response, code my notes in a program called NVivo, and code them into themes to perform a content analysis of the responses and to generate visualizations of the responses like this word cloud that shows that what most people focused on whenever asked about the challenges to agriculture in Galapagos was water. So qualitative methods allowed me to get a very quick view of broad scale patterns that would have been a lot more difficult to look at through quantitative methods alone. I wanted to share another one of the most surprising responses that I got from people was that when I asked them what are some of the agricultural pests in Galapagos, and people kept responding, oh yeah, those damn finches. Because as it turns out, finches can be quite destructive for crops. And we're talking about finches, the famous Darwin's finches, a protected emblematic species of the Galapagos, and they are an agricultural pest. Even this was mentioned more than rats even. They can decimate farmers' crops. Some estimates were as high as 60% on a regular year, and on really bad years, they can just take out the entire crop. And they, and this I mentioned not only because I thought it was shocking, but because to point out the power of qualitative methods, that it allowed me to see beyond my preconceived notions. And well, as a geographer, I would also bring a blank map of the agricultural areas to the interviews. And I would ask people to mark on the map what are some important elements for them, anything, again, open-ended. And this was particularly relevant in the island of San Cristobal because in the last few years, there had been increasing amounts of sightings of tortoises within the agricultural area. And this was a new thing, it was a new change. When I first interviewed members of the Galapagos National Park back then, they were convinced that it was not possible that the tortoises were coming all the way from the northern region because they needed to cross the entire island, cross lava fields. They were like, no, it's not possible that the tortoises are coming here. These tortoises must have been kept as illegal pets, or maybe they ran away from the captive breeding center that is located much closer to the agricultural area. But so whenever there was a tortoise that was being reported, the tortoise was promptly removed from the agricultural area and taken to the captive breeding center and then sent back to the northern region to its rightful habitat. And I'm not convinced that, just pointing out that the agricultural area was being treated as a non-habitat, just given that it was a non-habitat, but given the interview results and the models that I just showed you, I am not convinced that this is the case. I think it's very possible that tortoises do belong in the agricultural area after all. Here, marked in green, are the very general areas where farmers reported seeing tortoises with their approximate dates. Ever since this happened in 2016, there was already the first full survey from tortoise populations by the Galapagos National Park. So since I started this study, the Galapagos National Park has confirmed that indeed the tortoises are most likely migrating from the north. So that's a nice result, and it matches my results as well. And you can see that here marked in purple is the boundary between the protected area and the productive area. And as you can see, some farmers saw tortoises well into the agricultural area as well. Another interviews also suggested that farmers have a complex relationship with tortoises, and that is often mediated by their economic activities. Some farmers, especially in Santa Cruz, some of them do want to have tortoises because they attract tourists to their land. Others tend to ignore it, like those who have livestock. They don't really care because they don't see the tortoises as a competition for their cattle, for their food source. But farmers who have crops, especially those that have small, farms, can be really damaged by a tortoise that comes in and tramples their crops and eat their crops. So they really do not want the tortoise being there. So they plant these living fences using porotillo that make it really hard for the tortoise to get through. And this is most likely disrupting the migration patterns. Another thing that farmers reported is that there are some tortoises that would get tangled up in the barbed wires, and they had spotted injured or dead tortoises stuck within the fences from the farms. And similarly, farmers have a complex relationship with guava, the invasive plant, and that is because this plant is essential for many farmers to help them cope with drought as part of a silvopastoral system. Now, silvopastures is the practice of growing trees alongside grass for cattle to be able to graze. Guava trees and pastures are an extremely common pairing in the Galapagos ecosystems, and I will quote one farmer who explained the multiple functions that these plants serve. They said, first of all, I make an excellent guava jam. I mix it with banana or plum. They're all excellent flavors. Of course, guava is an excellent food source for animals too. But also see here, and he pointed to the lichen that was hanging down from the tree branches. This is a moisture capturing mechanism. What do the Enchanted Islands need to maintain their freshwater resources? It needs that the highlands have water. This lichen captures the moisture from the fog. Even if it does not rain, this is always dripping. Furthermore, guava trees have an extended root system, not a deep root system that consumes freshwater reservoirs. So it protects the soil from erosion, and it protects the moisture in the highlands. What we care about is that the mountain remains humid. And there's also the use that we give it with pastures as a shade-providing plant. Any grass that grows below the guava remains green. If you remove the guava and leave the grass, the sun will soon dry it out, leaving behind only dust. So as it turns out, guava are essential to help farmers adapt to extreme droughts, like the one that occurred in 2016. Interviews suggested that farmers with silvopastures were able to cope and withstand it much better than those with grass monocrops. So to answer my initial question, there are very few examples that can simultaneously address the three goals that I put out. The most compatible models that I have seen are farmers who use agroforestry methods, meaning the use of tree crops, specifically in coffee cultivation, to fund their efforts to clear their land from invasive species and maintain it to keep tortoises on their land because they host tourists on their land. There are also similar efforts that I have seen where farmers intersperse their coffee with native trees to attract birds, and then allows them to market themselves as bird watching sites. But to quote the farmer who explained this model to them, it only works if you do all at the same time. You need to grow food and conserve the habitat, and to make them all financially sustainable. It doesn't work if you only do one. So I thought that this was a very clever design, very clever plan where they were using the funds that they got from selling coffee and using it to keep their lands clear from invasive plants, which is an extremely expensive endeavor. But if there's one thing to take away from all of this is that agriculture and conservation are allies. They are not foes, and they better start acting as allies if they are to survive the forces that threaten them both. Namely, a system that has allowed people to live separate and disconnected from their food and their environment. This here is an image from an article published by Xiao and colleagues that shows the change in land cover in Santa Cruz from the year 2000 to 2019. And you can see invasive species marked in red and urbanization marked in purple. These two things threaten both agriculture and conservation. It threatens agriculture because, especially urbanization, it threatens agriculture because you cannot grow food in pavement. And it threatens conservation and tortoises in particular because animals tend to die on the roads. This is a well-known problem with smaller animal species like birds, but sometimes tortoises are also the victims of car collisions. So concerned farmers have offered many ways in which conflicts with tortoises can be reduced by blocking off specific crops only temporarily and very localized manner using solid structures, because they notice that if tortoises are able to get their head through a barrier, are likely to push through and break the fence. So they recommended that type of fences. They also recommended to require fences to have a minimum height that allows the free passage of tortoises underneath it, and that the bottom wire not have barbs on it to prevent them getting stuck. And you can also, if you go there, you see that a lot of the farmers on the highlands have their shells scratched, and it's because of the barbed wire. Scientists have already suggested that it would be a good idea to clear invasive species from the migratory routes of tortoises to help them go from their nesting sites in the lowlands to the highlands. And even though scientists have proposed this, I haven't seen a specific plan being proposed by this. This would open up new opportunities for farmers. And I also want to mention projects such as Servidumbres Ecológicas have been very successful at involving farmers in tortoise conservation. This is a program that took place initially like about 10 years ago in Isabela, where farmers were threatened by poaching because there is still a tradition of eating tortoise meat there. A decade ago, the program began to show people that tortoises can be more valuable to them alive than dead. And in this program, the Galapagos National Parks gave captive bred tortoises to be hosted to select farms so that they can be transitioned to the wild, as you know, until they reach a certain size. So this was a very successful program because it provided an additional source of income for farmers, and it prevented the tortoises from getting killed. But farmers from other islands like San Cristobal have pushed to expand this program, even though poaching is less of an issue on their island. This expansion has become controversial because it is seen as being politically motivated rather than from a legitimate conservation concern. And I am using air quotes to say legitimate, once again to point to the power struggle that exists between agriculture and conservation. And I would say that, yes, this was politically motivated in the sense that to expand this would mean to have the decision to expand this program had people in mind as well, and not just the tortoises. And I would argue that the benefits of involving the local population and giving farmers opportunities to diversify their income sources would benefit conservation beyond just the handful of tortoises that are in question. But I should point out that that so far the role of all these suggestions are still answering the question, what should be the role of farmers given conservation goals? I think it is only fair to flip that question around and to ask, what should be the role of conservation scientists given food production goals? And with that, I just want to say that I am extremely grateful for the opportunity that I have had to dedicate my life to these subjects for the past few years, and that people beyond academics have taken an interest in these subjects as well. Some of the most truly memorable conversations I had took place in places like this one, a small rural school where farmers and conservation scientists were able to exchange knowledge for one afternoon with plenty of coffee and tamales. I am also happy to report that since the land cover maps were published, they have been used for things that go beyond anything that I had originally envisioned. From controlling invasive insect populations to creating bike routes, and as I was informed yesterday, to be used as part of the official cadastre system of local municipality of Santa Cruz Islands for valuing rural lands. Once again, the maps are published with an open access license. So full data sets can be found in the supplementary material section, so nobody needs to ask me for permission to use them. And I will include a QR code at the end of this presentation, so anyone watching can download them as well. Okay, it takes a village to write a dissertation, as it turns out, and I need to thank so many people, so many institutions, the Galapagos Science Center, the Institute for Geography, UNC, the World Wildlife Fund, the Ministry of Agriculture, INIAP, and the Galapagos National Park. Thank you so much for taking a chance on me. To my committee, also, so Dr. Stephen Walsh, my advisor, I was so lucky to be his last student, as I found out. So very fortunate for that. Gabriela Valdivia, Kongi, Javier, Carlos, and Diego. Thank you all for teaching me so much. This has been an amazing experience. I'm gonna have to keep this next part really short just to allow some time for questions. So I'm gonna have to rush. I should need another hour just to thank the number of people that were involved really in this. But some of the main collaborators, Lorena, Ronald, Michael, Carolina, Gonzalo, Mia, Erika, and my funding sources, especially the World Wildlife Fund. Thank you again, once again, for taking a chance on me. And it's been great collaborating with you all. Again, I was literally putting together this presentation right before we started. So there's a lot of people that should be in these photos that they are not. But I want to thank the multiple families that I have found during the project. Many of these people were friends before the beginning of this project. Many of them became friends during this project, but I'm happy to report that I have lost no friends, at least as a result of this project. So thank you to my Galapagos family. Thank you to my UNC family. You all are all amazing. Geography seems to attract just wonderful people, and I've learned so much from all of you. Cannot thank you enough. And also to my Quito family, and also you are a source of support, and I look forward to seeing you all again. And to my family, again, you are the most, I was very happy and fortunate to be born into this family. I didn't choose you, but I think I'm glad that we're all still together. So with that, we have a little time for questions. I will try to unmute everyone. And this is, if you have any questions, please let me know where is, thank you so much. And I'm gonna figure out how to unmute people.
Okay, thank you, Francisco. We have a little time for questions. We're appreciative of the broad strokes of the presentation to give you a sense of what you've worked on and what you found and how you did and what the motivation was. But let me not take any time and ask if there's a question. Remember, you can raise your physical hand and I'll try to get to you, or you have an electronic in reactions. Again, I don't see everybody, so I might miss certain individuals.
I just allowed people to unmute themselves. So now if people have a question, they can also just speak up.
Obviously, the committee will have another 2 hours with this young man. So this is mostly for the public.
Gee, how do I do this?
Yes, please.
Let me see. Am I? Now, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Dick.
Yeah, I had one question about the implication. I think this is a marvelous dissertation, and I wish I had been down in the field with you to see some of the things that you were doing and the interviews. It would have been fascinating, and I can see that you may want to be doing further work in the region. You're going to be recognized as an expert now. But I have one practical question. I think at the end you were talking about farmers. You're trying to take that perspective. You go into this as an ecologist and you come out a little more sympathetic about the struggles they're having. What would you think would be good possible crops or ways that they could diversify or improve their production, the value of their output per unit of land? And maybe this is not only production, but I think of choice of different crops or maybe mechanisms for marketing their products.
So that's a great question. Thank you, Dick. The quick answer is coffee is what is the most valuable cash crop there. It is perhaps the only thing that is being exported to outside, and right now, like perhaps sold in some of the most expensive places around the world. That as marketed as Galapagos coffee, which is very gourmet, and it has its own taste. So the quick answer is coffee. The one thing I would warn against is that you can't eat coffee, like you can't feed people with coffee. So
right.
Whilst recognizing that coffee is probably an important part of this strategy, I would not leave aside things that can actually feed people in the Galapagos.
You don't see that they could produce something successfully and cheaply enough to compete with what comes from the mainland?
Oh, that's tough. No, competing with what's produced with industrial methods, it's just not possible. And if anything, it is something that can be done is to input taxes for the things that are imported into Galapagos while they are in season. And this is projects of like this is happening. So for example, during tomato season, tax if someone wants to import tomatoes that are coming in.
Yeah.
And just to make them competitive, or to encourage people to buy local tomatoes rather than that. And that is happening to some extent.
We have just time for another question or so. Is one more question from the group? I'm sorry if I'm missing you on multiple pages here.
I have a question.
Yes, please, go right ahead. Yes, Angelica?
Okay. Thank you, Francisco, for this great presentation and work. I have a question related to the differences between what ecology and biology is saying about this invasive species and how they may affect the island, and what the farmers perceive. So I guess my question is, what do you think, in which direction research should be thinking in a way that those ideas reconcile a little bit for the benefit of the agriculture and conservation?
Thank you. That's a great question, and one that I don't necessarily know that I have the answer to. I know that how I answered that for myself was I just went out there with no subject, just to talk to people. That was my first field season. I literally went out there with no set subject, and just to go and ask them like these open-ended questions that I was talking about. And that's where I just saw that there was all the conflicts that I saw. And that's how I found how I wanted to use my skill set, my interests, and fit it with the local needs. So my only advice to that would be talk to people and ask them how you can be more useful precisely for that, because I don't have those answers.
Okay, I'm going to close down the public presentation. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Francisco, for a wonderful presentation. Yes, we are all happy for your presentation. Thank you. For the committee, please stay connected. For all others, please feel free to leave now. Again, thank you for participating. For the committee, we will start in 10 minutes. So we will start at about 2:16 on my clock. Give you 10 minutes to grab a sip of water or whatever, and we'll start again. So everybody, please leave but the committee. Again, thank you all for attending. Ciao.
See you, Steve.
So good to see everyone. Thank you so much for coming. It's weird talking into the void, but it's so great to see everyone. Thank you so much for coming.